with climate change, similarly, we need to very profoundly change our lifestyles to tackle it. So the Committee on Climate Change recently quantified the proportion of changes needed to reach our climate change targets, our net zero targets, and altogether 59% of the measures that we need to reach net zero will require consumers to change their behaviour. So things like buying electric vehicles instead of petrol or diesel vehicles, installing heat pumps, in our homes. Don't know why that's moved ahead. Sorry about that. Changing our diets and so on. And all of these, make up actually a majority of the measures needed to get to net zero. Even more recent analysis says that the average UK carbon footprint will need to reduce from 8.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide, where it is at the moment, to 2.5 tonnes by 2030. So in 8 years, we need to go from 8.5 tonnes to 2.5 tonnes. So an enormous change to our lives. I don't know if you caught yesterday's Telegraph, and many of the other newspapers also reported this. This is from the IPCC's latest assessment report. The behavioural implications of tackling climate change were really brought out in this new report. In fact, it was the first IPCC report to have a chapter dedicated to behaviour change, basically, to all the social and behavioural changes needed to mitigate climate change. And so emphasising the need to drive less, fly less, eat less red meat and dairy, work more from home, waste less, etc. And so if all of these sorts of behaviour changes added up, they would contribute about 70% of the changes needed. So in the sort of ballpark that the Committee on Climate Change were talking about. I don't think these changes have really been communicated by the government adequately. I don't think most of the public are aware quite how much of their behaviour is going to need to change to address climate change. But we have seen very recent changes in our behaviour over the last couple of years due to COVID. But the side effect of that has been actually, at least in 2020, we saw a very significant, in fact, an unprecedented drop in carbon emissions. So 7% drop in carbon emissions in 2020. And that was mostly due to the travel restrictions. So people not flying as much, not driving as much. So we know that people can change their behaviour, but in this case, it was because they were complying with COVID restrictions. And so in this talk, I want to emphasise that COVID shows that change, very profound change, is possible. But obviously a side effect of COVID, I mean, many negative effects, but has been loss of jobs, the fact that we've been cut off from friends, family. There have been many negative social and economic consequences, not to mention obviously health impacts. But what we want to do with climate change is not to have a very sudden, just let's stop doing everything and let's sort of grind the economy to a halt. We want to address it in a way that is much more planned, that brings people with us, that ensures that people who work in high emission sectors are provided with skills and jobs so that they can work in greener sectors rather than just having massive job losses, etc. So we need to learn from COVID, but in a way that is much more kind of planned. We don't have a lot of time, but we have a little bit more time to design measures to address climate change. There are important differences between COVID and climate change, and that really tells us something about the challenges that we face in tackling climate change. So on the one hand, climate change is less tangible and probably less emotive for a lot of people. So the sorts of images that we see might be of polar bears as opposed to people in hospital. So there's a much more human face often to COVID. There's also, I think, a sense that for COVID, if we change our behaviour, we can genuinely protect ourselves. So if I wear a mask or if I avoid going out, I will be less at risk of contracting COVID. Whereas with climate change, if I switch off all my lights, if I stop driving, if I go vegan, I may reduce emissions very slightly, but it doesn't mean that I will necessarily be less impacted. I will be just as much affected, because this is such a huge problem that everybody needs to be changing their behaviour if we're to reduce the risk. So the sense in which I can actually protect myself is different for climate change than it is for COVID. Similarly, there's a lower social norm to act around climate change. If you think about the sorts of behaviours we see around us and the things that fill our TV screens and are on the media, high consumption lifestyles and materialism and having a high carbon footprint is essentially quite a normal sort of, and even a status symbol. These are things that people maybe aspire towards very often, whereas and so we don't really see people adopting low carbon lifestyles as kind of the norm. Whereas with COVID, when at least during most of the restrictions in terms of lockdowns, we could just look out the window and see the streets were empty and people were complying, and that then encourages people, well, then I better comply because this is what everybody's doing. So we don't have that sense of everybody's in this and taking action with climate change yet. Something I'll also emphasize is that so far with climate change, there have been far fewer government signals that we even need to take action on climate change. Whereas with COVID, it was very clear that our leaders were standing up and saying, this is an emergency. You have to stay home. The message was very, very clear. There was enforcement. So there was no ambiguity that this was something we had to take seriously. And similarly, actually, the solutions to tackling COVID were actually relatively straightforward. We just had to avoid contact with other people. When vaccines were developed, we had to take those and so on. You know, there were just a series of things which once you did those things, we were able to control. We have been able to control the virus to some extent. Whereas with climate change, the solutions are much more nebulous. We do know a lot about what will tackle it, but it is really about changing everything we do. And so it's not that we can actually just say to people, hands, face, space. There is no 3-word motto to address climate change. I'd say we also have a lower political mandate to intervene in people's lives when it comes to climate change. We're not there yet where people will actually say, yes, that's fine, I'll just stop flying, or I'll just give up meat, or, you know, we do need to engage with people and develop that sense that that people do need to change. So we haven't yet got that buy-in. And the changes needed to address climate change are going to be long-term or permanent. So we are going to need to consume less in the long term. We are going to need to change our behaviour, work and live in very different ways. And this is not just about the next few weeks or months where maybe we can tolerate locking ourselves away. We're talking about a really permanent change, and that's a much more difficult sell when we're talking about changing behaviour. I want to just elaborate a little bit on some of these points, because I think this is really at the core of why it's difficult to tackle climate change. So COVID is a less psychologically distant risk. So if you think about the sort of the images of climate change, as I mentioned, of climate change, then analysis shows that for a long time, images of climate change were polar images of ice caps, of glaciers, those sorts of kind of things, which for many people were quite distant. They might have been polar bears featured. Very rarely were humans featured. Even now, when we look at, so this is from work by a colleague at Exeter, she's studied all the visual representation of climate change in the media. And while we've shifted away a little bit from some of the polar imagery, that's declined a little bit. We have smokestacks, we have still equally rather remote and not very engaging imagery. So we don't really see people featuring very much in images of climate change. And in as far as we have metrics to measure climate change, it's carbon dioxide emissions, which is not a sort of unit that people are particularly familiar with, and you can't really maybe imagine what a ton of carbon dioxide looks like. So sort of rather difficult to get your head around even how we sort of measure the impact or the causes of climate change. And as I mentioned, sort of the norms in terms of behaviour are really much more around consumption than reducing consumption. And with COVID, this is really different because the images are much more people focused. They feature people suffering, and many of us will have known people that maybe got very ill. Images as well of people complying and changing their behaviour, wearing masks. And again, we look around ourselves and we see that those people, the norm to comply is very much there, whereas it isn't with climate change. And in terms of the metrics, it's numbers of people dying, it's deaths. It's something that, well, we understand what that means, and that's an incredibly moving and visceral sort of concept. So everything really about how the two risks are communicated is completely different. So inevitably we sort of see COVID as being something which is psychologically very tangible, very proximal. We see climate change as something which is psychologically very distant. But another important difference between the issues is how the government have responded. So we did a study that we published last year, which showed that actually people judged the severity of COVID based on the fact that government had imposed a lockdown. In other words, they thought, well, it must be bad if government is taking such drastic measures. I've never seen a lockdown happen before. So that must mean this is a serious threat. Maybe this is the most serious threat that we've ever had because we've never had a response like this before. And also the way in which they judged the risk like that in terms of the government response, the more they tended to support those lockdowns as well. So they actually sort of reinforced that there was that sort of feedback loop that they supported the policy as well. And that contrasts completely with government response to climate change. So when we've interviewed people in the past about maybe their views on climate change and why they maybe are not willing to take action, they say, well, if it really was that serious, if it was a serious threat, well, governments would be doing something, wouldn't they? And we'd be made to change our behaviour. Well, since that's not happening, I guess it isn't that serious. And those are exactly the sorts of things people do say as a reason why they're not willing to engage, and they don't see that it is a serious threat. So again, they infer the severity of the risk of climate change from the government response, which is not a very significant response. It's by many scientists' views, it's not adequate. And in fact, not only is it not adequate, there are some pretty mixed messages. So if you look at the sorts of things which government have been doing and announcing over the last just year or so, we've had Bristol Airport and several other regional airports being expanded or plans to be expanded. Last year we had the Chancellor of the Exchequer halving domestic flight duty. This was within weeks of the UK hosting the UN climate talks in the UK, the COP26 talks. In the run up to that, we were actually cutting duty on domestic aviation. So again, when we interview people and survey people, often it is very clear to the public that the government is just don't seem to be taking it seriously. On the one hand, they say we want to do something on climate change, but clearly they don't seem to be actually following through. So this then really gives the impression, well, maybe it's not actually that serious an issue. Not only that, the way in which the policy around climate change in the UK is framed is very much about technology will save us. So if you look at the net zero strategy, which was published in the autumn last year, the forward from the Prime Minister is really quite interesting. He says, for years, going green was inextricably bound up with a sense that we have to sacrifice things we love. But this strategy shows how we can build back greener without so much as a hair shirt in sight. In 2050, we will still be driving cars, flying planes and heating our homes, but the cars will be electric, the planes will be zero emissions, we will fly guilt-free, etc., etc. We will unleash the unique creative power of capitalism to drive innovation. And the strategy is very much around the technologies that will enable us to continue with our lives as they are, and not change our behaviour. And that really contrasts, as I say, with the report that came out yesterday from the IPCC, which was that we absolutely need to change our behaviour because technology alone is not going to solve climate change. So we do face this message from the government that, well, you don't need to change your behaviour. So understandably, people are not actually aware that they do need to. That comes through then when we look at some other recent work that our centre has done, explicitly asking the public to sort of compare COVID and climate change, and on a number of different measures. So colleagues asked, who do you think is responsible for tackling COVID and for tackling climate change? And they certainly place a fairly high level of responsibility with government for tackling both. But when it comes to individual responsibility, they place much more, they see individuals as being much more responsible for tackling coronavirus than they do for tackling climate change. So it's that there is a gap there, which is, I think, reflects the sorts of rhetoric that government, how the government is framing it. So people feel less personally responsible for limiting climate change than they do for tackling COVID. Similarly, when asked whether they feel their own actions are actually effective to tackle climate change and to tackle COVID, we see again that gap. So people see that their own action is less effective to tackle climate change than COVID. And again, looking at the willingness to accept restrictions to personal freedoms, people are less willing to accept restrictions when it comes to climate change than for COVID. So, in other words, in a sense, the social contract is not as strong for climate change as it is for COVID. We don't have this agreement that, yes, that's fine for the government to regulate or to restrict our behaviour in any way, because it just doesn't feel like this is something that is really our responsibility. So people are really sort of saying this is government and not so much us. But we really need to build this social mandate for climate action. At the moment, there isn't that sort of sense that people have to be part of a transformation or a transition to achieve climate change targets. And what we know is that actually people's sense of fairness is one of the most important things when it comes to predicting support for policies. In fact, actually some work we did found that the sense of fairness of policies is more important than the sense of it actually them being effective. So it's more important that a policy is fair than it is effective. And part of fairness is so-called procedural justice. In other words, a sense that people that are being affected by a policy have a say. And actually, we know that the more you do involve people in decision-making about policies, those policies tend to be actually better quality. They've factored in a greater range of views, of people's lived experiences, and so they tend to be more workable. They tend to actually be better, as well as fairer. So it is important that we give people a say in how we address climate change, because they're all going to be affected, but also because if we want these policies to be workable, we need to understand the drivers and barriers of behaviour change, what will actually get people to change, and so on. So, and we need to build this mandate for change, for the profound change that we're going to see. We also need effective communication. So remember, I said, we have this 3-word slogan when it comes to communicating COVID. We have hands, face, space. Now, can we come up with something like that for climate change? I don't know if we can. It might be possible. But what we do know about effective communication is that actually you also need to understand what's important to your audience, actually, so that messages resonate with them, so that they pay attention and think, oh, this is something that is relevant to me. This is the basis of segmenting audiences. This is what marketers do a lot, is they kind of figure out, there's a group of consumers over here who are really concerned about the environment. We'll tell them that our product will reduce landfill because it uses less plastic or whatever, or it uses recycled materials. Whereas this group over here does not care at all about the environment. So we'll just say, this mineral water makes you feel good. And we'll emphasize some of the more self-interested benefits, if you like. And so we know, and advertisers know, that those sorts of differentiating your message according to what your audience cares about really works. And when it comes to promoting green behaviours, it also works. So in one study where they were trying to communicate about the closure of a car park in an office, at an office site, they told employees that this would enable them to save money because they could walk and cycle. They would get more exercise. For people taking the bus, they'd have more time to read. So they highlighted all the tangible personal benefits of driving less. And that was much more effective than when they talked about the environmental benefits, which, well, might have appealed to a few people, but more people found it motivating to think about what was in it for them, essentially. The good news is that actually most of the things that we need to tackle climate change have wider benefits, so-called co-benefits. They are good for us in other ways. They achieve wider goals. In the report that was published yesterday by the IPCC, they actually show this very clearly through a really detailed analysis. And I know you probably can't see the detail on this slide, but what this big table basically shows is that all of the sorts of things that we need to do to tackle climate change, from investing in electric cars to reducing food waste to designing products differently, etc. All of these things have, the majority of these things have positive impacts in terms of well-being, health, finances, the economy, biodiversity, and a whole range of other sustainable development goals. So the blue bits are the darker blue are the more positive impacts for other things. And so, yes, so a big review that they did showed that of the various options to mitigate climate change and to reduce energy demand, they found the majority, almost 80%, had positive improvements, led to positive improvements in well-being, and very few, only 3% actually detrimentally affected well-being. Now, this massively contrasts with the message from the Prime Minister, which was go green and you have to wear a hair shirt. You have to give up things. You have to sacrifice things. What this is saying is the exact opposite is true. Go green and actually it will improve well-being. And we've also just published a paper actually in the last few days, which shows this very clearly, and that it also shows that this holds for rich countries and poor countries. So we measured well-being across 7 very different countries around the world, and we also measured people's green behaviours, and we measured lots of different things they were doing, from cutting down driving and flying, changing their diet, engaging in community action and various other things. And what we found was that across all of these different cultures, there was a positive relationship. So the more green people were, the more they reported a higher sense of well-being. And this isn't the only study to do this. Actually, there's really consistent evidence that people who are greener tend to be happier. And conversely, there's other evidence showing that the more materialistic people are, the lower their well-being tends to be. So this means going green isn't about sacrifice. It actually improves quality of life. And I think this is a really, really profound insight that then we can communicate to people when we're saying you need to change your behaviour to tackle climate change. But we can say, and that's good news because it'll improve, it will make you happy. We can also communicate that things are starting to change, and we know that the more we can make a change seem normal, make a behaviour seem normal, the more people will tend to comply with that. you may have seen this sort of sign in hotels that you've stayed in, talking about that most people in the hotel reuse their towels. So, use it again and don't ask for a fresh towel every day. Well, in some classic social psychology studies, when they talked about, in quite specific terms, the proportion of people, the majority of people reuse their towels, they found much higher rates of people reusing their towels. So, and similarly, even for more recently, for changing travel behaviours, you don't even necessarily have to have a majority. You can just say people are starting to change their behaviour to travel more sustainably. And that was found to increase the use of public and active travel by 5 times compared to the baseline. So the more we can say that actually people are starting to adopt low carbon lifestyles, the more we can create and convey this social norm, the more likely we are for people to start to want to comply with that. Communication alone won't be enough, of course. We know actually from a lot of evidence now that information by itself, and similarly sort of, so-called downstream interventions, things that try to change people's sort of attitudes and sort of, focus more on the individual, they tend to only be about 2 to 3% effective in changing behaviour. So they're not very effective. Changing the context in which people act tends to be much more effective. So nudging, changing the sort of choice architecture, the defaults, or the kind of the accessibility of different things, that can be on average 25% effective, but actually in some cases even more effective. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. In one very nice study from colleagues at Cambridge, they found that doubling the proportion of vegetarian options in a number of canteens, previously it had been 1 in 4 of the options were veggie, they increased that to 2 in 4. So you could still choose meat if you wanted to, but 50% of the choices were vegetarian. That increased vegetarian food sales by up to 80%. So that didn't even take away choice, but just changed the availability of veggie food. An even more impressive study changed the default energy tariff that Swiss consumers were on, from previously having been fossil fuel energy as the default, which then you had to opt in to get a renewable tariff. So there was effort involved. When they switched the default to being a renewable tariff, so everybody was automatically on that, and you had to opt in to have a fossil fuel tariff, which would have saved you a little bit of money, actually. So it was slightly cheaper to do that. Very few people did switch, so they just went with the default. And what they actually found was that it went up from 3% when fossils were the default to almost 90% when renewables were the default. And that was a long-lasting effect. So just changing defaults can be like one of the simplest things we could do to just changing certain types of behaviour, at least, on a huge scale. We can obviously change the physical environment. That's definitely one of the things that we really need to do for transport. It's difficult to use nudging for transport effectively, but we can redesign urban environments so that there's more space for cyclists and pedestrians and less space for cars. So the incentives are shifted. The attractiveness and availability of active travel is increased compared to car use. And of course, economic measures like congestion charging and so on, those can certainly play a big role as well and change the incentives for people. The more we can combine interventions as well, the better. So what we know from studies where they incrementally added bits of interventions to see how much behaviour could be changed, giving people information alone, for example, these sorts of posters to encourage people to reuse their coffee cup, only changed 1% of behaviour. When they added in several other aspects of the intervention, so they implemented a charge on disposable cups, so you had to pay extra if you took a disposable cup. They also distributed some free reusable cups. they managed to change behaviour by 38%. So a huge improvement by adding in other things that basically removed the barriers to behaviour change, made it much easier and more normal and accessible for people to do the right thing. But the very final thing I just want to say is that it also matters when we change behaviour, because one of the biggest barriers to behaviour change is habits. A lot of what we do every day is quite automatic. We're sort of on autopilot. So we probably travel to work using the same mode and probably on the same route without really thinking too much about it. And when we have a strong habit like that, we tend not to pay attention to information about other ways of traveling or whatever the particular habit is. So we tend to sort of be quite have almost tunnel vision, basically, and that means it's quite difficult to actually change habits. You have to have something very significant happen to sort of get people to do something differently, and that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen in ways that maybe people are themselves in control of. So when you move house, if you choose to relocate, or if you choose a new job or start a family or retire, that's a very big life transition event that then means that you will have to change a number of habits at that point. You'll have to figure out, how am I going to travel from my new house to the shops or to my workplace? And at that moment, then you pay attention to information and incentives and what other people are doing. And so behaviourally relevant information suddenly becomes very salient and influential in your decision making. So you consider the options. You don't just go with whatever you used to do, because everything's changed. So what that means then is that we can actually intervene more effectively at those times to try and shift people's behaviour. And it's not just those times when maybe people are choosing, but also maybe when there are unanticipated changes and disruptions. So the closure of a motorway, for example, or a pandemic. These are huge moments of change, huge periods of disruption to people's habits and lifestyles. And if we intervene during these moments of change, it tends to be much more effective than if we intervene to change behaviour at times when people's habits are more established and stable. This is a nice example of this, where German researchers gave residents in a city a free pass, a one-day bus pass to try the bus for free, and some information about the bus timetables where they lived. And they gave that intervention to people who had recently moved house in the last few weeks. So this is the relocating group. And they gave the same intervention to people who had not recently moved house. And what they found was that bus use more than doubled amongst the people who had just moved house, because they paid attention. They were willing to consider using the bus because this was information and an incentive which was very relevant to them, and they didn't have this tunnel vision that kind of blocked paying attention to that. Whereas for people that hadn't recently moved house, they had pre-existing very strong travel habits, which meant that they basically didn't really use or consider this incentive. So there was a small but non-significant change in their behaviour. So basically, if we intervene when habits are disrupted, it's much more likely to be effective, which leads to thinking about other sorts of moments of change, like the pandemic. We know from the history of inventions that actually a lot of innovation is triggered by, or at least accelerated by, a crisis or some sort of major disruption of the kind, like the eruption of a volcano, which in 1815, Mount Tambora erupted, led to widespread famine, disease, a whole range of different problems, including the death of many horses, which was how people often got about at that time. And that necessitated the need to find some other way of travel, and so accelerated the invention of the bicycle as an alternative means of transport. And so if it hadn't been for that, the need to look for an alternative, that wouldn't have happened. And this is converging evidence from a number of different fields that really timing matters, actually, that you wouldn't necessarily have had the bicycle invented at that point if it hadn't been for that huge global crisis. So we've just been looking at actually whether COVID has represented something similar for fostering low carbon habits. So we have massively changed our behaviour in the last couple of years. To what extent are the habits that we've started to develop, or some of the behaviours we've been forced to adopt, to what extent might these stick in the longer term? So we've been tracking a representative sample of the UK public over the last 2 years. We started collecting data in the first wave of the pandemic, and we asked people also at that point what they used to do before COVID. And then we've asked them subsequently about their behaviour over the last couple of years, and we're just about to do a final wave of data collection. And we published a couple of briefings on this, but I'll just give you a few insights from this. So what we found is that, and probably this will resonate, some of these things will resonate with you, your own experience, online food shopping very significantly increased. It doubled during the lockdown. A lot of people trying that out. Food waste reduced very significantly. A lot of people were cooking from scratch. They were planning their meals. They were preserving and using up leftovers, partly in order to avoid having to go out to shops and just to not potentially put themselves at risk. So, and they also had more time to create food, and a lot of people were experimenting with baking and various things. Consumption went down for many goods as well. And of course, a lot of people started working from home. We also found, interestingly, that how people spent their leisure time changed. So before COVID, compared to what now, as I called this on this graph, but this was basically during the first lockdown, gardening, the proportion of people spending their time gardening increased, and the proportion of people spending their spare time doing sort of creative hobbies, art, music, etc. increased. The proportion of time spent shopping for non-food items, so sort of discretionary shopping, really decreased. And interestingly, these shifts are in the direction of lower carbon sorts of activities that people are doing. So there were sort of encouraging trends there as well. And when we ask people, what of the new things that you've been having to do during lockdown do you want to continue when restrictions are lifted, if anything? What we found is that very few people said nothing at all. I hate everything about what I've had to do, and I want everything to go back the way it was before COVID. The vast majority of people said, oh yeah, there are things actually I'd quite like to continue in the longer term. So we've sort of coded them here, categorized them here. So various leisure and hobbies that people started taking up, e.g. kind of music and things like that. Exercise, a lot of people took up walking and cycling, shopping online, thinking about the environment and spending time in the garden, and so on. And so these are a couple of quotes that I've just included. I'd like to do more online grocery shopping. I want to do less entertaining at home, which would save me time, energy, money, etc. Spending more time in the growing vegetables, visiting family, garden centres, etc. Well, those were the intentions, or the sort of hopes that people had in the first wave of our survey. So that was kind of May 2020. And then we went back to people towards the end of around November 2020, and we asked people, what are you doing now? And what we found was that at that point, the restrictions had started to relax, and consumption and food waste had gone up, not quite to the pre-COVID levels, but quite close. Home working remained reasonably high, and so did online shopping. Also, we know from other research that walking levels, the amount of walking that people have been doing has remained quite high even now. So that's something else that seems to be sticking to some extent. car ownership and car use is down now compared to pre-COVID as well. So it does seem like there are several habits, working habits, shopping habits, travel habits, that have been possibly permanently reconfigured. Obviously, it's hard to know at this point, but it does seem like now that we're sort of in a kind of post-COVID world, despite case numbers, a lot of the things that we have started to do in the last couple of years, many of them are actually sticking in the longer term. And many of these things are lower carbon habits, and that's quite important. Interestingly, concern about climate change hasn't been dented by COVID. So we've actually seen an increase in the proportion of people saying that addressing climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency or a high level of urgency over the course of 2020. And that our latest survey data seems to suggest it hasn't dropped off even now. And even support for various climate change policies as well, very high support. So an acceptance that we probably or definitely need to buy energy efficient products and appliances, that we need to be shifting away from car use, limiting the amount of flying we do, cutting down even on the amount of meat in our diets. And these are things which, at least certainly the flying and the cutting down on meat, these are things which even 3 or 4 years ago, we would have had a lot higher level of resistance to changing these sorts of things. But now there's acceptance that we should be doing these things, and things need to change, and we need to be part of that change. And this is actually, some of these levels of support are even higher than people supporting the COVID restrictions at the height of the pandemic. So actually, COVID does, I think, represent a huge moment of change to promote sustainable lifestyles. It's an opportunity in many senses. We have seen people's lifestyles profoundly change, and to a significant extent, that's in a low carbon direction. So low carbon habits have been fostered, but crucially, many of these things will not stick in the longer term unless they are supported by a wider change in the infrastructure, in incentives, in norms. In other words, we need to support and enable people to continue doing these sorts of things. The good news is, though, many of the policies needed to reach net zero, and which will involve us changing our behaviour, are actually supported by many people. So, to conclude, we do need very radical social and behavioural change to tackle climate change, in the same way that we needed radical lifestyle change to address COVID-19. And we've seen that change is possible under certain circumstances. And so really it's about translating what we learned about how to tackle COVID and some of the things that didn't work so well into tackling climate change. We know that, for example, engaging with people to build a social mandate for the change required is going to be critical. We need people to understand their action is essential. It will help tackle climate change, that it isn't going to be technology alone. We need to convey that actually there are wider benefits of doing that, that actually it can make you happy if you change your behaviour to be greener. And we need to have a range of different interventions, not just information by itself, that won't be enough, but we need measures like changing the design of cities and towns to make it easier to travel in sustainable ways. We need to change prices. We need to change the availability of different low carbon goods and services, and so on. And finally, we need to get the timing right. We need to intervene when people's habits are weaker. And actually, we've had an opportunity here with COVID. I don't think that window is completely closed, but I think there are things that we could have done before to really lock in some of these low carbon habits that people have started to adopt. And I shall stop there.
We're waiting for Don to come back, but in the meantime, maybe we can all unmute ourselves and give Lorraine a big round of applause for another riveting talk. 20 years after she first gave a talk at the BLSI on climate change. So thank you very much, Lorraine. Maybe we can all show our appreciation.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lorraine. So I'll pass you straight back to Andreas, who will look after the questions. And
Yes.
I see there are quite a few in the chat room already.
Yes, we've got quite a few questions in the chat room. As Don was mentioning at the beginning, feel free to unmute yourself, show your video, and ask the question in person. So I've got a hand up already by Keris Humphreys. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, you focused on government and the individual, but not really on organisations. So how do you address organisations that undermine behaviour change by intentionally maintaining infrastructure that actually promotes undesirable behaviour and stops individual behaviour change? Thinking of things like Bristol Airport expansion to have large car parks, and even locally supposedly supportive organisations like our hospital and university who insist on having large car parks which generate traffic that will interfere with reallocation of road space. How can these organisations be made to change their own behaviour rather than adopting a fiction of sort of outsourcing these parts of their emissions and sort of abdicating their responsibility for those, their customers, if you like, their employees who use their climate unfriendly infrastructure that no doubt is income generating?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And I guess I probably should have said, actually, what we know about social transformation is that while government is critical for providing the framework and the rules by which we achieve that change, the public, as I talked about, is a critical element to that, but so are businesses and organisations. And so it's kind of the three together: businesses, the public, government have to be working together. And so I think you're absolutely right that businesses and organisations and employers have to profoundly change as much as everybody in society does, and they need to provide also the incentives and infrastructure to enable us to change our behaviour. And I think there are interrelationships between these three groups of actors. So as individual actors, many of us are employees, and so we can, or even employers. We might have senior positions within some of these organisations, so we can use that influence to make changes within our professional lives and change supply chains, or take away bits of parking at work or whatever, or at least we can lobby people at work to make those changes. And the more that we put pressure on our managers and say we have to do something about this, I think collectively we can start to make a difference. Crucially, we need governments as well to put pressure on those organisations. So we really need a lot more intervention than we have at the moment, and incentives and regulations and restrictions and so on to force organisations to do more. So I think we can do so much from the bottom up, but we absolutely need a lot more top down, and businesses and organisations are a key part of making that happen.
Good, thank you very much. Yeah, I personally always thought from the bottom up was a good way of starting, but I think we're so close to climate Armageddon that we need to do it both ways, top down and bottom up. But we've got plenty more questions here. Lee Bazalgette, you've got your hand up as well. Do you want to ask a question? You just need to unmute yourself, Lee.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Sorry, I wondered whether Keris was before me, but it was great. Thanks for your talks. Really super interesting. Lots of great stuff in there. So I got three things that I'd like to ask, but I don't want to take up everyone's time. So I'll just start with number one and see how we get on. I'm interested to know what you think about, I'm using the word privilege in this sort of context of people who can be bothered to make a conscious decision when it comes to things like the climate. So as you said, when you remove the option, like flying becomes not an option, we can't buy fuel with lead in it, for example, we can no longer get hold of CFC fridges, that kind of thing, where they've been removed, they're no longer a conscious decision in the same way that, say, organic food or buying vegetarian. And you mentioned some nice examples where, like the Norwegian energy thing, although it was more expensive, people were kind of nudged into it by it being the default option. But I wonder, at the moment, you see a lot of kind of climate positive things are more expensive. Even things like as we know, taking the train versus flying, a super clear example of ridiculous policy. But to what extent do you think that kind of an extent of financial privilege, or people who are somewhat financially privileged are the people caring about this? And when we step out into the wider sort of community, it becomes much less of an issue for so many people. I'll stop there and let you answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, while there are some low carbon options which save you money, I mean, walking and cycling is likely to be cheaper than driving, and you can reduce food waste, and that will save you money and turn down your thermostat. So there are things that will save you money, but very often, you're right, there are major cost barriers to taking climate action. And buying electric cars, definitely a good example. Buying a heat pump, all these sorts of things which would really significantly reduce your carbon footprint, cost a lot. And so there are cost barriers. And actually what we've found in our most recent research, which was around public support for climate change policies, is that we saw quite a big divide in terms of high income and low income people in terms of their support for a range of different policies, that actually people thought this is something for the rich. And so people who are better off tend to support those policies more, and people on lower incomes tend not to support them so much. So there is a perception, whether it's right or wrong, but I think broadly right, that actually addressing climate change can be very expensive. I mean, there are real cost barriers. So we need government to intervene to remove those sorts of barriers. We do need businesses also on board to kind of help with that. But at the moment, a lot of the incentives are completely in the wrong direction, and domestic flights are an example of that we had the levy reduced. So it's even more expensive, relatively speaking, to take the train to Scotland than it is to fly. So that's insane when we have a climate crisis. So I completely agree is the bottom line there.
Okay, good. Claire Sweetenham is next. You've got your hand up as well. Claire, do you want to unmute yourself and show your video and then ask your question?
Absolutely. Right, let me just do the video as well. Thank you. I thought that was really, really interesting. I think 2 points and then a question about role models. I think that one of the key issues with this is that governments operate on a very, very short-term basis. Their driver is to be re-elected. And so the argument is that when you're actually trying to do something with any government, you have to almost work in that framework. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that government structures are so silo-focused that actually, again, trying to get a comprehensive approach is really, really difficult. With COVID, it was easier, it was health. And actually, if you looked at what happened with health, then all the other departments played catch up after that. So I think you've got those playing into this, which are really strong negative issues. So I guess my question to you very much is the value of role models in campaigning has been seen to be so powerful. And I do wonder in this particular area, whether it's about the development of role models on a very national and local basis that can influence both politically and organisationally, which is the way to change behaviour around this, because I think that integrates your 3 components you talked about. And I wondered if you've done any work on that and any thoughts about that.
Brilliant points, brilliant question. And I completely agree with you about the political barriers. The electoral cycles are definitely an impediment to getting longer term change. It was at least fairly significant that we got a cross-party consensus on climate change a few years ago. So at least with a change of government, we're not completely undoing everything, but it certainly does not help when they're kind of going to be focused on the next sort of election. And climate change tends not to be a sort of an electoral sort of issue in the same way that things like jobs and other things will often win votes. And the government and the siloing across government, yes, absolutely, we find that very much. I mean, because climate change really involves everything. It's so profound. It's like there isn't a government department that shouldn't be massively focusing on net zero. And interestingly, I'm part of the House of Lords inquiry on behaviour change for net zero at the moment. And that silo working is very much coming out as a big barrier to the government doing enough on climate change, that they sort of say it's all part of the phase, that the sort of the energy and business department's responsibility is nothing to do with us in, you know, these other areas like transport and planning and health and things. So yeah, that is a big barrier too. And so to your point about role models, yes, absolutely. What we know is that people learn from other people, and they look to people like them, and that they respect, and those role models and those peers are very influential. We know that scientists are a very trusted source of information, but when it comes to changing behaviour, maybe we look more to people amongst our immediate sort of friends, family, neighbours, and employees, etc. So when we're kind of thinking about what's a normal thing to do, where should I go on holiday, what should I buy, what should I drive, it's the people immediately around us that we look at. And there's some really interesting research that looked at so-called neighbourhood effects, which is where you see where people are adopting things like solar panels or electric cars, and you see that there are very localised kind of patterns that actually, once 2 or 3 houses around you get solar panels, or your neighbours buy an electric car, you're much more likely to as well. You sort of, it seems like, well, this is a thing that people are doing, people like me are doing, people in a similar situation, so this is an option I should consider. So it starts to change norms in a way that is very tangible and impactful. And we've started to do colleagues of mine, that we have a PhD student who's looking at specifically kind of leadership and role models in this area. And it's quite difficult to actually pin down who is a very good role model for taking climate action. So David Attenborough obviously gets mentioned quite a lot as somebody that everybody listens to, regardless of your politics or your position in society. So there are 1 or 2 people that you could say they are a good person to communicate with everybody. But what we often find is that usually the role models or the leaders or the people that look up to are different for different groups of people, and so we sort of need to get into different networks to try and influence people actually. So I think it's quite challenging, and I think we need to sort of utilize media and social media a lot more than we are at the moment to try and change norms. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done though, so I think we're only just scratching the surface of this issue.
Yes, thank you. Well, the whole topic of role models is a whole psychological issue in its own right that could be studied endlessly. Now, we've got so many questions in the chat room. I'll go to Tony, though, first, before I go to the chat room, because I think you've asked a question anyway in the chat room, haven't you, Tony? So off you go.
Lorraine, as you said, both COVID and climate require behaviour for the common good. COVID showed local communities can be brilliant at this, but the government's failure to vaccinate the poorer half of the world show that governments and nations really failed to behave in the global common good. So how can governmental behaviour be changed to act in the global common good to tackle climate change?
Ooh, that's an excellent and very tough question. I think we have global frameworks like the UN Convention on Climate Change is an attempt to, so the Paris Agreement was set up really to get global cooperation on climate change. So, and at COP26, some progress was made, certainly not as much as most people would want. And it definitely became clear that, well, there isn't even enough national progress on climate change, but there's certainly not enough kind of support for developing countries and global cooperation on climate change either. But the framework is there to try and enable that to happen. So that is, I guess that's the sort of way, the mechanism through which it should be happening. And but I mean, it's clearly not happening fast enough. There isn't enough progress. So I think you're right to point it out as a major problem. And I'm not a political scientist, so I'm sure there is insight into how to design those sorts of global agreements in more effective ways so that they have more teeth. But at the moment, it's not doing the job it was set up to do.
I'm not a political scientist either, but to me, that is the biggest, very depressing lesson of COVID.
Yeah, I think
brilliant collaboration at the community level and total failure at the international level.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there are glimmers of hope there, because when we did this research around where we got people to sort of compare COVID and climate change, we kind of asked them, well, what was sort of, again, what were things that seemed to work well in tackling COVID? And people said, well, in our community, we really banded together. And we realised like how much we would support one another, and we would look out for, the more vulnerable members of our communities, and it sort of, people felt sort of good about humans as a result of it. And they sort of said, well, it would be nice if we could do something like that on climate change. And so there was something there around, well, maybe we should frame this more as like communities doing things, and again, highlighting the community benefits of doing that. So while it doesn't seem like enough is happening, and it's not happening enough at the global level, actually there's much more optimism, I think, when you come to the community level. So maybe that is the scale at which we ought to be kind of focusing our efforts to mobilise change.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we're going into the chat room, and I think I'll thank Tony for his link, sort of talking about COVID and climate change, because it's quite interesting. Some people have responded very differently to the link you drew between COVID and climate change action. John, there's a few which seem to be comments rather than questions, so I'll read them out, and if you want to respond, do. Otherwise, I'll carry on and read out the next one. John says, an alternative view of lockdowns is that the government panicked and they were an overreaction, not followed, for example, by Sweden. Then, do you want to respond, or do you want me to just carry on?
Well, I don't have a very good answer. I mean, I think because the scientists seem to say that we didn't, or a lot of the scientists said that we didn't implement a lockdown quite as quick as we should have done. But since I'm not an epidemiologist, I probably ought not to say what was the right approach in that sense.
Yeah, okay. Bill also says climate change impacts us at a distance, Australia and the Arctic. COVID causes deaths at the RUH. I think that's the point he's making about, this is much more visible, much more visceral, much more visible than climate change.
Agree. That was really one of the points I was trying to make at the beginning. It's very personal. It's very local. It's people that we know, whereas with climate change, it's some polar bears at the North Pole, and well, who cares about them?
The next one is one I put in, which probably is a one-word answer, but I'll do it anyway. Do we all need to take more personal accountability and hold businesses and the government to account?
Yes. But I think this does come back to thinking about the different roles that we play, actually. And I think often we as individuals are framed as consumers if we're thought about at all in terms of climate change. So the government will say, buy an electric car and you've done your bit, that's plenty. But there's so much more we can do apart from just buying things that are greener. We can vote, we can take to the streets and protest, we can go to work and say, hey, manager, why are we not doing things better here? Or if we have, or we order things through our supply chains at work, or maybe we're parents or we're members of communities, and we can just have a conversation with somebody else and say, what can we do about climate change, or how, why did you and all these things we can do. We can be role models. So there are multiple things that we can do to create change that, and hold other people to account too.
Good. Okay. Don is asking the question, action in climate change is vital, but is there a risk that people will come to regard it as being like the worst form of puritanical religion?
Well, I think this might relate to the point I was making about the social mandate for change, because I think what we don't want to have is the sense that people are making decisions for us about climate change, and that we're not part of that, and so it's being, change is being imposed on us. I think it's critical if we want to actually have this sort of social transition that is required to address climate change, that we bring people with us and they feel a part of that. So it needs to be fundamentally, and actually this does relate to some of the things which I think Keris was saying earlier about the political system. Yep. That we have these barriers to change, but the more we can involve people in a more participatory way, so citizens' assemblies and juries are popping up all over the place, and they give a much stronger say for people in terms of decision making about how we actually get to net zero, and then you do get bolder policies proposed through that process, and people willing to play their part as part of it. So Yes, no is the answer. I don't think it, and also my point about well-being, I think it makes people happier. So it isn't about hair shirts, it's about actually improving quality of life too.
Okay, well, that's I come to my next question, which is, to what extent does human psychology mean that we only change if it's in our self-interest to do so? How do we promote altruism?
I mean, I think, in as far as I understand the evidence around people's values and whether people are fundamentally good or bad, I think, you know, everybody is a bit of both. Everybody's is selfish, but they care about other people. And we've evolved to kind of, you know, have some level of altruism as well as looking out for what's, you know, good for us. So we have to design policies, I think, that don't rely on people completely having to, you know, make sacrifices or make very inconvenient or extremely costly choices. We have to design policies that enable people to change and reduce the barriers to change, so that to some extent it's self-interest. It becomes easier, it becomes cheaper, it becomes the norm, so that those things align, so that it isn't just relying on people being interested in the common good and always having to go out of their way to do the right thing. Actually, let's align things so it's also good for us too.
Okay, so I'll come back into the room, so to speak. Sue has very patiently kept her hand up all the way through this. So, Sue, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, hi, thank you. I was just interested, and you started mentioning about us being citizens and not just consumers and the role of protest. So I wondered if, in terms of your research, I'm sort of involved at XR in Bath, so it's sort of, that's where I'm coming from. Has there been any research done on what impact like very public and visual protest has on societal norms and that changing of behaviour?
Yeah, really good question. I haven't personally done research on this, but but my understanding is that trying to understand the impact of protest is quite difficult. So it's quite difficult to say that a policy changed because of this particular protest, because often it's sort of part of, well, there's a lot of media coverage and there's a gradual shift in consumer or citizen attitudes. And so to what extent was it due to, you know, a set of protests? It's not always clear, clearly, you know, the causality isn't clear, but it does seem like often protest does play a role in shifting policies and shifting societal norms. So I think yes, it does, along with other things. So I think it can really raise awareness. I think done in certain ways, it can actually bring the wider public with you. So sometimes it can backfire depending on sort of the type of protest, but certainly some protests really win people over and see this is, you know, something we need to take care of. And so then the wider public can put pressure on policymakers and businesses. So it does play a role, yeah.
Okay, look, we've still got lots of questions in the chat room, so I think we probably might not get to all of them tonight, but we'll try our best. Abby asked the question: how do we get the government to communicate the role of behaviour change and the benefits for well-being when they're so economic centric?
Well, I have to say, I do think we probably need to wait until there's a different government in power until we are likely to see a big kind of campaign on behaviour change, because I think at the moment it is absolutely about jobs and technologies and innovation, and that's where all of the discourse is at the moment.
Okay.
So but I do, yeah. I mean, I think gradually, the more we can sort of say this isn't a threat to economic growth and jobs, the more we can show that these things are aligned, I guess there's a possibility we might see some messaging in that area.
Okay, and then also we had Anne Pettifer, the British economist, giving a talk on the new Green Deal and the economics of climate change to some extent. So I would urge you all to go to the Virtual BLSI YouTube channel if you're interested in the economic aspects of this and how you can actually work climate change and economic growth together. I think that's a good one to go for. Okay, Adam in the chat room is saying, as it's now or never, is it too late to rely on voluntary action to bring about changes in the behaviour of the vast majority?
Well, yes. I mean, I just don't think it's very effective. So I think in that sense, yes, it's too late. But I don't think it would. Voluntary behaviour change is just not going to cut it when it comes to the scale of change we need to tackle climate change. We absolutely need significant government intervention. We need regulation, incentives. We need to throw everything at it, basically. It is not going to be enough just to maybe put out a few messages to say, would you like to turn off your lights occasionally? It's not just going to be enough. We know that there are huge barriers to behaviour change, so we need much more intervention.
Yeah. And the next question is, the canteen veggie studies, interesting, increasing veggie options presumably reduce the meat options rather than adding choice. So you're potentially removing choice to drive the right outcome.
I mean, you've removed a choice and replaced it with a different choice. I mean, there were still 4 items to choose from before and after. Previously, 1 of those 4 was veggie, and then 2 of the 4 is veggie. So, yeah, I guess if you are committed to only eating meat, then your choice of meat products has reduced, but there is overall the same number of options to choose from, but a larger proportion of veggie ones.
But there's quite a few sort of observations about the study that you've conducted. I mean, maybe you want to put the web address of the study in the chat room, Lorraine, whilst I sort of ask the question. That might be quite useful so people can note it down if they're interested in following up on the study. Phil mentions, will wave 4 research on climate change impacts of COVID be invalid with the increase in energy prices?
I mean, I think the increase in energy prices is going to be a challenge in terms of I suppose, the issue of climate change still remaining salient. But actually, a lot of the things that we need to do to tackle climate change do involve people reducing energy. So if there is room for people to use less energy, and obviously I appreciate some people are just using a minimum and just have nowhere to go in terms of reduction, like they can't reduce. But if there is discretionary energy use, then people can reduce it to save money on their bills. And apparently there's been a huge surge in interest around things like heat pumps and solar panels and renewable technologies, domestic renewable technologies, because people are sort of thinking, well, how am I going to be able to afford my gas bill or my electric bill? And so, but trying to invest in these things if they're lucky enough to be able to afford those sorts of things and think about their own energy security. So there may be an opportunity there, but it does also make it sort of difficult, I suppose, in terms of just people's capacity to or willingness to engage with other issues.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, the studies you've done, would you get the same results now if you did the latest wave, let's say in April 22, in terms of perceived comments about what people would do about climate change and how they would change their behavior? Or do you think we're going back to normal now that the government is proposing that we're back to life as normal after COVID, with all the restrictions having been lifted, certainly in England?
Yeah. Well, yeah, good question. I mean, I think some of those good intentions or sort of aspirations that people expressed in the sort of summer of 2020 are, I think, probably have diminished or gone, but I think some remain, because if you look at some of the behaviours that people are sticking with, hybrid working or working from home, a lot of walking and cycling, doing a lot more things online, not just work but other things too. People have seen that there are benefits to some of the things that they started to do, so some of those things are sticking, but then others, we certainly saw people saying, I don't think I would want to fly very much in the future, and clearly the number of flights has gone back up quite a lot. So some of those things that people said I don't think would hold now, but some clearly are. So I think it's more important probably to look at what behaviours are actually sticking, but equally some of the incentives to encourage behaviour change just haven't materialised. So there may be things that people would have done more of now, but they just haven't been encouraged or enabled to do.
Okay. And how do you disentangle the stated behaviours of people with the actual behaviours of people in things like correlation, regression analysis, that kind of thing?
What we have done in this COVID tracking survey is just measure people's self-reported behaviour and their intentions. But we have sort of tried to triangulate that where there is data on actual behaviour. So if you look at sort of consumption patterns, levels of actual food waste that have been collected, and travel patterns and things that are observed in other studies, then we sort of see fairly consistent things. But it is important, definitely, to point to the disparity between intentions and behaviour. So, as I say, a year and a half ago, people had some intentions which clearly have not now materialised. So there is sometimes a gap.
Okay, and then Claire asked a question. Marcus Rashford changed the behaviour of the Conservative government. Does climate change need some football players and sports people to come out as vegans and eco-warriors?
Yes, I would say, is the short answer. I think it comes back to this idea about role models and leadership, and we absolutely need people that are, aspirational, people that are, that influence people and that people want to be. I think if they're seen to be changing their behaviour, and I think it matters with certain behaviours in particular. So veganism, for example, or at least vegetarianism, maybe has a perception of being, not for, people that want to bulk up, or, professional sports people. But actually, there are people that are professional sports people who are vegans. And actually, if you can sort of challenge that misperception that this isn't, if you want to be sort of big and strong and muscly, you'd give up meat. Well, actually, you can do that. So having those particular examples can be very helpful to challenge those sorts of perceptions.
No, that's a good response, because I think body culture is a big thing at the moment. So if people can realise they don't need to have a meat diet to be able to facilitate that would be very helpful. Okay, well, look, the questions keep on coming in, but we have to draw it to a close at some point. So before I tell you a little bit about what's coming up, can we please just give Lorraine another big round of applause for what she has presented us with today. Thank you very much, Lorraine. Oh, that's excellent. So thank you very much, Lorraine. And as I say, these Zoom meetings are not the same as real meetings, because when I press the button end meeting all, then that's it for the night. So I apologize in advance for that. I just wanted to give people a bit of an update in terms of what's coming up in the philosophy and psychology series over the next few months. On the 3rd of May, we've got Dr. Jason Koenig, Senior Lecturer in Philosophy from the University of Bristol, giving a talk on democratizing pandemic forecasting. So as you can see, the pandemic, we're not past the pandemic, even in our philosophy and psychology series. It keeps on going on. You'll be pleased to know then we move away from the pandemic in all shapes and sizes in June, when we have Dr. Karim Ismail giving a talk on Wittgenstein. And then we still have to organize quite a bit of the rest of the year. But we have John Gray, the author of Straw Dogs, which has got a huge cult following, the book that is, rather than the film, giving a talk on his book, or Straw Dogs, as well as feline philosophy. So that's in November. And then in December, we have Professor A.C. Grayling back to talk to us about the current global mood of nationalism versus internationalism. So that should be very, very interesting. So I hope you all join us for next month in May. And as I always finish these evenings, stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly of all, stay sane. All the very best, everybody. See you next month. Bye, Lorraine. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me. Take care.